So, good evening. My name is Krista Akampora, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the second in our series of 4 events, all on the theme of the experience of war, moral transformation, injury, and repair. There are 2 more events in the series, the details for which are in your programs and on posters that you'll find throughout the venue and upstairs at the reception that we're holding in the 4 Freedoms room after our discussion tonight. This event is made possible through the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I think this program is a good example of the fact that the NEH is not a partisan political organization. Rather, it enables us to discover and critically engage our cultural values, as well as perspectives, experiences, and aspirations that make us human. So I'm very grateful to the NEH and its chairman, William Breaux Adams, for spearheading this initiative, which is part of an umbrella of projects and programs titled Standing Together, that the NEH is sponsoring, which supports initiatives to explore war and its aftermath, promote discussion of military service, and support returning veterans and their families. The structure of Hunter's program includes hosting small group discussions of key sources in the humanities, which we read alongside exemplars of modern interpretation and application to the experience of war. Our theme next month is morality in relief, and the guiding idea behind that theme is that the experience of war can highlight and draw out important distinctive features of moral experience. Our text for the month is Phil Cly's National Book Award winning collection of short stories titled Redeployment, and our discussion series will culminate in an event where Phil will be here on April 25th, and you can sign up for that on our website, which is in your programs, but you'll also be receiving an invitation since you turned out tonight. The theme of the program for this month is the good life before and after war, and participants all over the city have been discussing Aristotle's Ethics, the Handbook of Epictetus, all read alongside Nancy Sherman's After War. So we are thrilled to have Professor Sherman here with us tonight. She is university professor and professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. She has affiliate appointments at the Center on National Security and the Law at Georgetown University Law Center and at Georgetown's Kennedy Institute of Ethics. Previously, she held the Distinguished Chair in Ethics at the U.S. Naval Academy, designing the brigade-wide military ethics course, and at the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. She has research training in psychoanalysis from the Washington Psychoanalytic Institute and regularly consults with military and veterans leadership and members in the U.S. and abroad on issues of ethics, moral injury, and post-traumatic stress. In October 2005, she visited Guantanamo Bay Detention Center as part of an independent observer team assessing the medical and mental health care of detainees. Professor Sherman has received numerous fellowships, including the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, among numerous others. And most recently, she's in residence at the Center for Ballet and the Arts at NYU this semester. Sherman's most recent book, After War, is the 3rd in her trilogy of books on moral injury, which include, in addition, The Untold War, a New York Times notable book, and New York Times Editor's Choice, and Stoic Warriors. And these titles are available for purchase upstairs. We also have Phil Cly's Redeployment, and if you sign up for a small group discussion, the first 30 people, we will give you a copy of the book so you can read it before you come, but it's not necessary to read before you attend. She's also the author of Making a Necessity of Virtue and The Fabric of Character, and the editor of critical essays on the classics, Aristotle's Ethics. She has written over 60 articles in the areas of ancient, Stoic, and Kantian ethics, military ethics, the emotions, moral psychology, and psychoanalysis. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sherman.
Thank you so much, and it's wonderful to be in this setting and to be part of an NEH-sponsored ongoing event that brings the community together with academics and gets us out of the Ivy Towers. Not that Hunter is such a place. And I want to thank you, Krista, and also Gina Sissoko for so much help, so thank you. And I want to thank the veterans and service members in this community. My own work really has been very much a way of getting beyond the thin crust of saying thank you for your service, having a conversation that does more than that. So what I'd like to do tonight is do essentially what I do is try to break down the Mil-Civ divide so that service members can really come home. I found myself over the past decade, 2 decades really, if you go back to the first Gulf War, in classrooms with veterans, some of whom actually were 05, 06 officers, admirals and captains in the Navy, colonels, generals, and they were trying to come home, and I wanted to help be part of that. So it's most of the stories I tell are from in-depth interviews, and it was a way of kind of embedding. So just some facts. About 2.7 million service members, troops, have returned from the current wars, the longest ongoing, resuming wars. Half of them have children, so there are in our schools 4 million kids that don't wear uniforms but are affected by war. That's not something we think about. There are 22 million veterans of all ages, and many of the current crop of veterans signed up post 9/11, and they, despite the national surge of interest in the military post 9/11, still, even in my hometown, DC, to see folks in camis is still viewed a bit as exotic, despite Walter Reed and the Pentagon. And I think both sides have to come out of the bunker. It's not just that the military can't talk to the civilians. Civilians sometimes don't know how to talk to the military. And so I think these programs are just fabulous. The story is also, pardon me, very personal. So I get this to work. Whoops, let's see how this works. Whoop, we're not going the right direction. Let's see, technical problems. Okay, here we go. My dad was a World War II veteran, a medic, crossed from the harbors here to Greenock, Scotland, about 14, 16 times. And when he died at 89, I discovered that he had carried his tags in his pocket with his keys. I'm a very close daughter, the only daughter. I saw my parents once a week or so in DC. I never knew he carried those. And so we had our don't ask, don't tell policy of sorts. And that unconscious motive, I think, has been with me. And a part of an agreement I have with myself not to have a pact of silence in the way that my father and I must have had one. So, moral injury is a buzzword. In this series, you've been thinking about it a little bit. It's in the press, it's in the clinical literature, the research literature. And to some degree, thinking about moral injury is really important because though we medicalized, you might say, and made legitimate war stress, war neurasthenia, shell shock in 1980 with the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistic Manual diagnosis, it was very behavioral. It was about a response to threat. Psychologists are very good at, especially the behavioral mold, thinking about fear, threat, life threat, survival, and responses that looked a little bit like the leading symptoms would be hyperarousal, detachment or numbing, and a kind of also intrusive thoughts, flashbacks. But that's not the only dimension, the psychological dimension of the after-war. It's not just the sense of being still in op tempo, if you like, operational tempo. It's the moral flavor of all that, and it's the moral anguish. And so PTS, if you drop the D for disorder, which some find very stigmatizing, PTSD doesn't capture the moral dimensions of psychological anguish. It also doesn't capture the sense that service members have a remarkable sense of personal accountability. They are taught that in the academies. They carry the weight of being there for others, and they carry the weight of being part of a cause larger than themselves. So that ethos is just not part of, I think, PTSD. So we need to be able to think more broadly about psychological injuries, including those that have a moral dimension. Now, philosophers have been on the sidelines of this. They're very interested in just war theory, going back to Augustine, Aquinas, Maimonides, the Bible, and they're quite interested in when is a cause for war just, the resort to war, the conduct of war just, how, and how much collateral damage. We're looking at that right now when we think about Mosul. What sorts of collateral damage, volunteer, non-volunteer targets, and also post-bellum, thinking about coming home from war or the justice we leave behind in the countries we occupy. But philosophers actually have a lot to say about the personal sense of moral accountability and not just the justification of a war or its conduct or its aftermath. And that's really what I'm interested in. And in particular, a philosopher in 1962 named P.F. Strawson thought a lot about ways that we hold ourselves accountable to others, to ourselves, but also to others, and he called them reactive attitudes, like guilt, shame, resentment, indignation, distrust, positive side, trust, hope, a sense of worth and goodwill. And I think those are critical for understanding moral injury, because I think moral injury is about the attitudes that you hold toward yourself and others, or as third personally, that register, I'm counting on you, or you harmed me, now how are you going to make it better? So a moral injury is a kind of harm, if you're in the law literature, a kind of damage of a sort, but highly personal. So in what follows, I want to think about these attitudes by which we beat ourselves up or try to heal afterwards. And I want to also think specifically about the interpersonal space. It's not just that you have attitudes, it's that you can show them, that you know how to make them public at times, or if not public, how you do the dance by which you sort of say, this hurts, but I don't know if you want to hear it. I don't know if you can hear it. I don't know if you can if I can count on you to hear it or listen or do what you can with it. That's a very complicated interpersonal space, and it is the space by which we hold each other accountable. And I want to think about that and how that is the healing space. That really is the healing space. I want to do it that's my real interest, and I want to do it by telling stories, some very contemporary. I've been in classes now for close to 20 years with those who have served. some very recently in classes on war ethics that I've taught. And I have very long-term, in-depth interviews. They go on for 4 years, 8 years sometimes. And so it's sort of longitudinal in a way, anthropological longitude. And their stories are going to be interwoven with ancient stories. I am an ancient philosopher, and so we're going to hear from a general. That general is Sophocles. And in particular, the Ajax and Philoctetes, amazing plays. And then I also want to highlight the voices of women service members. They are often ignored. They make up, 14 to 17, 18%. The Air Force is the highest number, the Marines the least. And they suffer moral injuries that aren't always to do with visceral, assaultive, killing, harming, torture, grotesquerie, but other kinds of moral injuries that I think are important to think about. And they're not alone in that. So that's the plan, and so let me begin. So the notion of moral injury is really not new. Jonathan Shay didn't invent it, I didn't invent it. It was hanging around there, and if you read, as I did last term teaching, the Apology or the Crito, Socrates is talking about it a lot. He's talking about how, in his case, you harm your psyche when you do something wrong. And you damage your psyche, he thinks, just in the way that disease damages it. Now, his notion, let me see if I can figure this. Let me just put this down, excuse me. His notion is that the perpetrator really is the one that gets harmed. That's probably too narrow for us, but it's picked up by the Stoics. They do believe that mastery heals a soul or a psyche, and wrongdoing by the agent is really what does you in. And as Krista was suggesting, not only have those in this community been reading Epictetus, but if you teach at the academies, you will soon learn that they love Epictetus. Marcus Aurelius is a favorite as well, and that's really how I got thinking about Stoic warriors, that my community was in love with the Stoics, and I thought it was time to tell them that the Stoics had some problems, that they weren't just all about armor, that the armor made you vulnerable at times. So let's begin even before Socrates and the Stoics, and that's really to think about Sophocles and Homer, whose tales he tells. Let's see if I got this going now. There we go. So Ajax is a good place to begin. He's a warrior par excellence. He thinks he's owed Achilles' armor, and there you have Achilles' armor. Thetis is bringing Achilles his armor. Now we know a lot about Ajax from Homer, that he's the giant god of battle, he's unrivaled, he's the bulwark of the Achaeans, powerful, well-built, and he also, if you remember, he brings Agamemnon off the battlefield. So he carries, he brings Achilles off the battlefield. And so he's sort of a key figure, and he's got an amazing father, and he never really forgets about his father because his father battled with Heracles, and so for which he got a war bride. And he's got to live up to his father's image. Now, Sophocles' tale in the Ajax is essentially that Ajax expects to get the armor, and he doesn't. The speech of fire Odysseus gets the armor. And this shame is suicidal. It leads to a dissociative break. And this is Ajax carrying Achilles off the battlefield. But he really thinks he owns Achilles' armor. He doesn't, though. And when he doesn't get it, he decides that he's going to kill the Achaeans. And he takes his sword and wants to show everyone that he really is the swordsman that he was claimed to be. And he's warding off his father. He says, I will return to Troy If I don't get this honor, I will return to Troy having earned nothing. How could my father even stand to look at me? So he's already prepping himself for a kind of naked shame. Shame in Greek, I just have to say, the word is eidos. It comes from idoia, which means genitals. And so he's really without his fig leaf. And he knows he's in a very vulnerable moment. So he puts his sword in his hand and he tries to kill the generals. Whoops. But what happens, in fact, is that Athena blinds him. He has a dissociative break, and instead he kills the barnyard animals. He wakes up in a bloodbath of carcasses. And Athena essentially says, he hacked this chief and that chief, but they were just animals. And so, in the face of this mutilation, he grabs his sword, and in an unrivaled moment in Greek tragedy on stage, he pierces himself, and it's a suicide. Now, when I saw this performed by a group called the Theater of War, I was in an audience this size, but they were only officers. And many of them were in the medical community, but not all. It was called Force Fitness or something like that in Phoenix. And the hush that went through this audience was unbelievable because, as you know, by some figures, 22 service members take their lives a day. That's probably an exaggerated number, but veterans. But there has been a suicide epidemic since 2009, and I've been at the Pentagon looking at the suicide review boards with the chiefs of the Army, and it's very, very, in rooms like this, doing cases of what happened on watch that month, and it's, there's no answer yet, and there's no biological marker for who's vulnerable, but it is ongoing, and we're still at risk. So this play was a safe text. That's what the NEH is essentially about. Let's find safe texts. And this was a safe text. And the person with whom I saw this, and with whom I was a panel, is this guy, Jeff Hall, Major Jeff Hall. He told me, my PTS, you have to understand, has nothing to do with collateral damage, killings, severed bodies, being blown up. It's from moral betrayal. That's what my PTS is about. And his story is rather interesting. And once you hear it, you'll understand why the Ajax story resonated with him. It's 2005. He goes to Iraq, and he's always wanted to be a soldier since 15, to engage and destroy. This is not what it was about. It was about COIN, about counterinsurgency strategies. And in particular, I sort of tell this in one of the chapters of the book, so I'll be very brief here. He was assigned to help a family that had been killed in the crossfires of a high target collateral incident. And it was a Christian family coming home from church at noon in the Mansour district. If you remember at the time, Paul Bremer was in charge of the CPA Coalition Provisional Agency, working with Iraqis. Sounds like a familiar story. It wasn't going well at all. And this man had to get the bodies home for a proper funeral. There was a young girl and an uncle that survived, and 3 family members that were killed in a car. It took about 3 to 4 months, and every turn of the way was a bureaucratic nightmare. The bodies decayed after 3 or 4 months in scorching heat. He had to go to the Iraqi Ministry of Health that couldn't get the bodies initially. His boss essentially said, "You do it, here's $750. He threw that at his boss's face and said, "That's piddling." He got a car for himself. The upshot is when the certificates of death finally came in red, it was stamped enemy combatant. This nearly drove him through the wall, and he said, "I've been working with this family over how many cups of chai? They're not enemy. They're civilians caught in a collateral incident." The Iraqi Ministry of Health said, "They're enemies." And that was the end of it. He went home to Kansas, and one morning he couldn't put his boots on. And here's a mask he made at Walter Reed. A story was featured in the New York Times today about the masks you will see. These were made in conjunction with the NEA, who works with NICO, National Intrepid Center of Excellence, in my home area in Bethesda, which is a unit that does warrior brigades. They bring folks in for 2-3 weeks, in his case, his family, and they worked on it. This is Jeff's horse, mired in mud. He could not move. And this was featured in National Geographic. It's with his family, him wearing his mask. Let me just stop there for a sec. So the moral injury, PTSD, a sense of hypervigilance still being on, doesn't capture what he was feeling. His was a sense of betrayal. His trust had been broken by too many people. He's a father, as you can see. He was trying to help someone the age of his daughter, and that mirrored his incompetence. Not only did he not have any weapons to be able to use, that wasn't what the mission was about. His goodness, that was his armor. His goodness was broken because he was betrayed at every level and he couldn't do his job. So I'm going to return in a moment to the ancients, but this is just a brief depiction in Ajax and the relevance of Ajax to this particular story. But let me just roll forward for a second. The actual term morally injurious comes from Bishop Butler. We have a modern philosophy, a historian of modern philosophy here. It's Bishop Butler, London, and the Rolls Chapel, about 1726. He was also the bishop. I was lecturing in Durham, England, who was very important in the north of England. And resentment was essentially the response to being morally offended or injured by someone. And it was a very revolutionary notion. Christians didn't have to turn a cheek. It was laudable and acceptable and important to feel resentment at moral injury. That was essentially Bishop Butler. So the locus classicus in the modern philosophical literature is really with Butler. I can say a lot more about the historical terms, but let me just, for now, tell you how I use the term. I'm not a clinician, though I've had some research training in psychoanalysis. I'm not trying to formulate a diagnosis that has a treatment code. I want to just bring out the moral dimensions of the psychological anguish. And as I said, not only visceral to do with assaultive incidents or grotesqueries, but also injuries to your person, whether it's discrimination, scapegoating, sexual assault, profound breaches of dignitary respect and goodwill. And my focus isn't on the stressors, the traumatic stressors in the way that one might list certain kinds of stressors. It's really on the attitude and how you communicate them. Now, it can be from the point of view of the perpetrator, that was Socrates and the Stoics. It can be from the point of view of the victim, that role. It can be from the point of view of the observer. And the observer is someone we forget about. This is one of the observers. He was my student who, I mentioned him, Thomas Gibbons Neff, in battle there, who went on to become an observer, a Washington Post correspondent, war correspondent, now has a byline. Here's one of his bylines, he returned to war. But that's an image some of you may remember. Mogadishu, 1993. I was reminded of this. I was at a theater in DC, Theater J at the JCC, Jewish Community Center, and there was a very interesting play called The Body of an American. It was about Paul Watson, who was the photographer who took that. And that person being dragged on the streets of Somalia is Sergeant David Cleveland. Excuse me. And Sergeant David Cleveland, at the moment that shot was taken, says to the photographer, his Canadian photographer, "If you do this, I will own you forever." That guilt of having shot that picture is what the play is about, and it was the nub of the, to this day, long-lasting guilt of the observer. Now, this is a very active observer. This is an embedded photojournalist. And he does shoot a picture. And we don't know the motives for Sergeant Cleveland saying that. Maybe he thought he would be memorialized in some way. But that picture led to Bill Clinton pulling troops out of Somalia. It had consequence. That's to say the reactive attitude, the feeling of guilt can be the perpetrator, it can be the victim, it can be the observer, the close-up observer. It crosses roles. Those attitudes cross roles. And that's important to know. So these moral attitudes of blame and shame and betrayal and distrust and guilt and resentment and all sorts of things like that. And their positive sides, hope, a sense of trust, a sense of goodwill, a sense of dignitary respect, also have a global side. We hear a lot about them lately, and it's something that some of those who are working on moral injury talk a lot about. And that is a sense of shattered moral identity, a sense of absolute rank moral disillusionment, a sense of moral anxiety that, like much anxiety, is boundless, a sense of moral dislocation. And that's important to remember. Many in these wars feel helpless, hopeless, complicit, not sure how to come to resolution, not sure what the causes were for which they were fighting and that were changing regularly with rules of engagement that changed. They're changing right now before us, and to some that's really awful. The whole name of the game to be an officer is to show discipline, and you may not be able to call in an airstrike if it's a population-centric area. That's what we're debating as we speak right now. So there is no universal soldier, if you remember Donovan sang that song, and who wrote it? Buffy St. Marie. I didn't realize that. I thought Donovan wrote it. The Troubadour. And these are some of the masks that are from Walter Reed, Melissa Walker. I have permission, this is open source, in an article they've written to show you. These are being done by service members who have come for healing for 2, 3, 4 weeks to Walter Reed in a Bethesda Naval, essentially, National Military Medical Center or something like that. There are more names that you pass by in Wisconsin Avenue, you know what to do with. They're very, very moving. And there's also a dance therapist there named Allison Winters, and I think the two of them should put these to motion to show the complications of expressing your feelings. These unmask trauma by graphically depicting what's felt in a way that verbal expression can't always do. These hang on the wall, and I actually was part of a little group that managed to get the VA to talk to the DOD, and we brought these masks, some of them to the VA headquarters downtown in Lafayette Park, essentially. They're moving. They're really, really, they give you a sense. You start off with paper mache and then you work on these. And there's therapy that goes on at the same time, typically group talking. That was, the tears were amazing, mixed with the aggression. Okay, so let's just stop there for a sec. So it's a spectral notion, ebbs and flows, delayed onset as trauma has. And what you have to remember is that it often, the moral injuries often don't track real culpability. That's the nature of this, that blame is easy to find, and it's not always deserved. It's, again, a legal term, strict liability. You claim responsibility even if you're not culpable. And for many clinicians, that's enough is enough, let's move on. But if you're taught never leave a fallen comrade behind, cover each other's back, bring all your troops home, you're 18, you have a black and white sense of morality, and it's your mission is to get those guys, those men and women home safely, then morality looks very black and white, and you're on a trigger sensibility, you didn't have enough sleep, your brain isn't fully formed, you're only 18, there's still a lot of soft tissue up there. You are prey for moral injury, and that is a lot of what you see. So that's kind of background to some of my work. But I want to now intertwine this with a story of a woman that was a Georgetown student. She's worked in the office of the Joint Chiefs. She has risen, but life didn't look very good for a while. Her name is Miriam Krieger. I have permission to use her name. She's Roberta in the book. So she came to talk to me. We got to know each other pretty well. This is now stateside. She arrives on a base, and her commander tells her, I fought against her being here. Now, this is a woman who was top of her class at the Air Force Academy. She's has had a presidential appointment of various kinds, no shortage of merit, and wanted to be a fighter pilot since she was 4 years old. She's been working at it and succeeded. And she said to me, he was essentially parroting the lingo on base, which is that she was disrupting the status quo, tearing down heritage and tradition. So she was a threat to the entrenched hypermasculine ethos of the base. And it was clear when I was talking to Roberta that she felt resentment for the mistreatment, but she also, this was a serious transgression. If I might remind you, the academies have been co-ed since 1976. This is 2012 or something like that. So long, long regression there. And it wasn't just that she felt resentment, and this is another moral attitude and injury that she felt. She felt moral disappointment. She had hoped in the command structure that they would be able to honor her position, and that the whole base didn't invest hope in her in the way that she invested hope in herself. So if you're thinking about moral injury as sort of a moral address, or, you've hurt me, you've injured me, and I am showing you my resentment. She was showing a sense of resentment and moral disappointment. But here's the deal. She couldn't say it outright. And that's the communicative interaction transaction space. The only way she could get uptake from her commander was to bring a male mentor in who had as many or more stars as he did. And that's how it worked. She not only had to do that, you can use Freudian terms here, she identified with the aggressor. She internalized the shame that she must not have been good enough or something like that. She couldn't change the regressive ambient social meanings on base. She started drinking with cadences louder than the guys at bar because, she's an alpha female and she's a pilot. She's got to show her strength. And this is a woman with a feminist background. Her mother is a judge. It didn't come easy to her. And the way she put it to me is, she said, Professor Sherman, I know this sounds kind of trite, but I felt like I lost my moral compass. And by that, she said, I'm a pilot, and you get spatial disorientation if you're at a certain number of G-force accelerations, gravitational accelerations. I felt like I had turned upside down, but I couldn't navigate anymore. And so she had a very visceral sense of being morally injured that almost made her professionally disabled in a certain way. So she felt isolated, marginalized, normatively isolated, normatively marginalized. And it wasn't that they couldn't get it, it was that the men wouldn't get it. It wasn't a capacity, a competence issue here. They were invested, and the system was invested in not getting it. So I think this sort of underscores a kind of moral injury and the reactions constitutive of it that she needed, and how she was able to go forward by bringing in male mentors who could address another in the, say, can I count on you to correct this situation? And that's sort of how it went forward. Now, so what you're hearing is a kind of call and response. The moral injury is, I think of it as a way of blaming yourself, blaming another, holding another accountable. Cleveland was holding account almost as a corpse, holding accountable the photographer that was going to take his picture. If you do this, I'll own you forever. What's your response? What was Watson's response was, you got me. I'm guilty for my life. And that kind of call and response, you know, we know it from rock and roll, we know it from gospel singing, but we also know it from Seneca in a different way. And his is not call and response, but it's a game of catch. You have a ball and you throw it back and forth. And if you want someone to be able to catch the ball like Miriam wanted her commander, you better throw it in the right way. And she had to had to have someone to throw it to such that it could get caught. And I'll just read you a little bit of Seneca because I think it's so apt. He's thinking about gift giving, but it's really about any kind of moral address. I'd like to take up an analogy which our own Chrysippus, that's one of the Greek Stoics, drew with a game of ball. It falls to the ground through the fault either of the person throwing it or the person catching it, while it remains in play by passing properly thrown and caught from one pair of hands to the other. A good player needs to send it off differently to a tall partner than to a short one. His example is, don't give a country bumpkin books and to read. That's not a gift that will ever get any gratitude. Don't give someone a winter coat in summer. But similarly, if you're giving a gift, make sure you're giving the right gift such that it can be caught. And I think that's really what's going on in the difficulty of expressing the hurt. So let me move to another example. This is not the woman I'm about to talk about, but it could be. If Miriam's example is about hope, just think about trust, and then I'll wrap up at that point. Trust is a really hard emotion because you want to trust someone you think is trustworthy, but you have to assess whether they're trustworthy. You have to make an estimate about whether they're trustworthy. And often you have to say, can I count on you to count? Can I count on you to be counted? You almost like, can I ask a question before you ask a question? You preface it with a little tap dance about, am I sizing it up okay to get in the game with you, to even make that first pass? And so this came up for one of the persons I talk about in the book, who I will call Sally. Now, Sally was Air Force again, but in a joint mission, and she was one of the very few women there. And this is how she said, I met her at UConn, University of Connecticut. She came up and started talking to me. And she said, there was this repeated pattern of sexual harassment. And she said, it began at crack of dawn at the Chow Hall. She said, all heads lifted when I walked in. She said, I felt like a deer in hunting season. And what upset her the most was that the officers led in the staring. They were ogling, and then they had this sense of shame, she said, like, I shouldn't be doing this, so their heads would drop. Then she said visits to porta potties, presented another routine problem. These were international coalitions, and whether it was Americans or not, there was a lot of graffiti. But there was also the problem of where to gingerly place your tampon so that you didn't leave malodorous residue behind. That Halliburton, she said, hadn't thought about that. This is a big issue. Not only are you afraid of going to the bathroom, but then you don't know what to do about a tampon. She was stalked on email about a relationship she never had, but she said, the real problem was the laundry incident. So I said, what's the laundry incident? Well, she's doing her laundry, and then her panties and bras were stolen in the middle when she went outside during the washing machine dryer moment, or changing the load. And what really hurt her was that she's young. She's 18, 19. Her mom had set her up with all these things. Care packages are what you write to home about. You don't ask for a whole new set of underwear. And she couldn't explain it. She sort of bit her pride and asked. But then the next challenge, again, how to navigate the delicate space to begin to heal and show your injury. Then how to raise it with her commander. She was in a war zone. This seems trivial even to her, but she's without underwear. She began not to sleep well, or it was affecting her combat readiness, professional life. And she thought, but I'm inside the wire, not outside the wire. More global threats are looming. And then she said, this is very interesting, and if you remember Carol Gilligan's work in I was at Harvard at the time, so I don't know, late 70s in A Different Voice, she said, I think I wasn't compassionate enough. After all, these guys were predators, she said, but here she says, this is her quote, I'm sure in an all-male shop the sexual urge was just a little more rampant and the frustration dealing with that built up. I always struggled with whether or not I was kind enough for them. I always struggled with how much I could put up with and how much I couldn't. So she blames herself for this. And she incorporated a readiness to forgive, to accommodate. So her past was going to be that she was going to be forgiving in the past. You know, they can't catch it. I'll have to throw it really the way they can catch it. But she wasn't quite sure how to get uptake. And in the end, she didn't really successfully do it. She ended up walking to Chow with a knife strung around her dog tags on her neck. So I want to finish with the ancients. None of this perhaps is all that surprising. Emotional expression takes management, coping, skill, a ready audience, moving someone into new normative space, we might say, moving them along. Hoping is really asking someone, come with me. I have hope in you. Is it warranted? Even if you're not there now, can you be there soon? It's sort of trying to bootstrap someone into a new space. And similarly with trust. Can I trust you? Let me assess you. And this, I think, is very important when you think about interrogation and, for me, the Philoctetes, which I'll end with. So interrogation is really about building trust in order to exploit it. Military interrogation is about rapport building in order to exploit it. And you're constantly dancing with someone. Do I have your trust or don't I have your trust? I think I do, so I'll move one step forward and see how that goes. But it's a game of catch. You get brought down and you can get damaged as the interrogator as much as the interrogated. And also, you can have positive feelings. You can fall in love with the interrogated, as in reverse Stockholm syndrome. I had a student I wrote about in Untold War, Will Quinn, who had a little romantic alliance with someone, and the woman picked it up. And she put her hand on his knee and gave him a Koran and asked for a Bible. And he always felt kind of badly that he had slightly broke a boundary, that there was like a little bit in psychoanalysis you would call countertransference. He was reacting in the relationship in a way that was not quite in role. And that is amazingly, in my mind, spelled out in Sophocles' Philoctetes. And I have seen this and been part of a reading of this downtown at the Aquila Theater, a plug for the NEH, Peter Meinig's group that's all veteran troupe that often performs this. And here's the story, again, about a trust dance. Philoctetes is on an island. He's marooned on an island. And what's the island? Lesbos, one we know about these days. He's marooned because he has a stinking fetid wound on his leg, and they don't want him crying anymore on their ship. He's too much. He's a burden to this crew. But he has this amazing next Trojan horse, and it's a bow. And the Greeks believe that this bow is their last chance to get the Trojans. And so Odysseus sends this young warrior, Greek name is Neoptolemus, means young warrior, to that island to get the bow. But in order to get the bow, he's got to build a little trust. And he begins by saying, you and I share a grievance. It's true, they both came out at the short end for a while of Odysseus' ploys. He says, it's sort of a staged trustworthiness. You and I sing the same song, he says. Abused and insulted by Odysseus, deprived of what's rightfully ours by that bastard Odysseus, I hold the commanders accountable. And Philoctetes is moved. You're right, we do share the same cargo. We share common grievances, he says. So the rapport overture does its work, and Philoctetes allows Neoptolemus to touch the bow. Neoptolemus asks, is it okay? Is it permitted if I touch it? And it's not like, am I sacred enough to touch this holy object? That's how it's often been interpreted in texts. It's really, do you trust me enough to hold that bow? And Philoctetes says, yes. And what he says is, I'm counting on you to count on me to give it back. And a dance begins between the two of them of this kind of counting on each other. And what's really interesting is by the end of the play, Neoptolemus becomes trustworthy. He actually believes in Philoctetes. He befriends him in a real way. And so the moral address goes back and forth in healing ways. There's a real trust bond that gets built. It's a space for positive growth. And I think that really comes out in that play. It's a remarkable play. So this takes me to the end. And I want to be sure I bring a picture up of a woman I've worked with a lot, Alicia Huron, a Navy sailor. If you want to think just about women, think about women on a 300-person boat where there's only 2 or 3 of them alone for 3-month deployments. That's hard. She spent a lot of her days looking out at sea and wondering when and if she was going to jump ship or jump off, because she had been sort of put on a fake trial of a sort. She was brought to captain's mast on false charges in a way. And I write about her, but we sometimes forget about women sailors. I think it's really important. They're very isolated often, long time at sea, and without support of other women on their moving bases. So this takes us to the work of moral repair, and that's really what I've been trying to talk about, the space, the transactive, interactional space, where you feel enough confidence and trust to be able to show your emotions, but you often may need proxies to do the work for you, sometimes with one more stripe or star than you've got. And I think we play this role in universities. My work is non-clinical. I'm in a classroom talking about texts like these. Many of you here are doing that right now in these ongoing dialogues. And the moral injuries aren't only the gruesome detritus of war. They're very much about what we see outside of war. Rape on campuses, sexual assaults, betrayals by those who are your seniors, a sense of overburdening survival guilt that so many feel and that I write about. And the space for healing really, I think, is transactive. It's about being able to, if you feel distrust, to try to explore what trust looks like, as in the Philoctetes. If you feel betrayal, trying to come to some less ultimate act than the suicide that Ajax had by stepping in. Moral addresses that reciprocate back and forth. And I just might think, cadences, which are often, and my students remind me how horrific they are, military cadences are very deeply misogynistic, but we can come up with more positive cadences, more positive call and responses, games of catch in the classroom, outside of the classroom, ways of those of us who haven't served taking some accountability for the wars we've sent our citizen soldiers to, and citizen soldiers coming home to be able to be greeted by us with more than just, thank you for your service. Thank you. That's not a fake picture. Allen Ginsberg was about to walk in. And those are cadets at military, what's it called? Military Institute in Virginia, VMI. They were prepping for the moments when he was coming in. And why was he coming in? Because his gardener, whose name I've forgotten, but who actually was also a photographer and took that picture, taught at VMI, was an English professor, and he said, "How about we read Howl, and I'll bring him in."
So we have lots of time for your questions. Jada has a microphone, and we just ask that you ask your question in the microphone. This event is being streamed to our audience at SUNY Oswego and everywhere else. And so would you like to take your own questions?
Yeah, please help me.
Okay. All right. So the floor is open.
Can we have people identify themselves? Or your call. Mm-hmm. Just wait for the mic. Yeah.
I'm a Vietnam veteran. I was in a medical unit, and we had a lot of young female corpsmen and nurses. And maybe this is generational, but I do not remember, and I can tell you that I never knew of any kind of sexual abuse or rape or anything like that. And I was in a unique position to know about that. I would have been called about it. And I'm totally, I think, shocked about what's going on in the military today. So I'd like to, maybe you have some insights into this. Have you interviewed veterans from, other wars about this sort of thing? Because I really don't know about that.
So I haven't, but I have some generational sense of this. And I know a lot of women who are women officers who, some of the nursing staff from Vietnam, but also others from, sort of the first Gulf War who came back to the Naval Academy. What counts as sexual assault has varied over the years, and what counts as worthy of reporting has varied over the years. I have to say, when the remarks came out about Trump, 6, 7 months ago, regarding some of his behavior, I had friends that were my age who have never said a word about the sorts of chasing around the table that went on in government offices in D.C. They themselves as attorneys in some of the agencies, and others, famously Susan Bryson, who's in our field, a philosopher, who wrote a remarkable book called Aftermath. And I should just say the PTSD was a diagnosis that came up as a confluence of Vietnam vets returning home and women in Boston, primarily at Boston Lying In and other places, Brigham and Women's, whatever it's now called, reporting very similar symptoms, the women after sexual assault and rape. Herman has an old book called Fear and Trauma that's well worth remembering. So anyway, I mention that because I had a little whiff, and Susan Bryson sort of said, why didn't I report this earlier incident, which had to do in her undergraduate days, which was a rape. She said, it didn't occur to me that it was a rape. And I think there's a lot of women in professions who have endured a lot and been silent a lot and believing, a little bit like my young woman Sally here. Maybe I'm not compassionate enough, maybe I didn't do this, or maybe I didn't do that. And so reporting is still a huge, huge problem. And by the way, rape is not just a female issue in the military. There's by some statistics, very high numbers of men as well.
Thank you. I have a question about a form of moral injury that I encounter from everyday people asking me when I say that I have lasting guilt for having fought in Vietnam in a war that I think was reprehensible. It's not unusual for people to say to me, well, you were only doing what you were told. You were sent there, you know, you shouldn't feel responsible for it. And over time, I realized, I say, but wait a second. I said, I grew up in the shadow of Nuremberg. And I learned that I was only following orders was not an acceptable excuse. So how can you tell me that that should alleviate me of my feeling of guilt? And they look at me, and their eyes get wide, and they give me the feeling that they think that I'm crazed for feeling that way. And it happens repeatedly. It's not a one-off thing. And I'm wondering whether you have encountered that blockage between people saying I was only following orders is not an excuse, and then telling somebody to let go of their guilt because they were only following orders.
It's a critical, really, really important question. The past 20 years since we've been involved in these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the philosophers, I think, have really come forward. And they've essentially questioned Michael Walzer, who was a dear friend and someone who wrote, was at Harvard at the time, and in the heat of the Vietnam War, Just and Unjust Wars, to rethink the war tradition, the just war tradition, thinking about contemporary, the war that was so embroiling this nation. And there's been a revitalization of just war theory and a critique of Walzer. And the critique of Walzer is essentially that just conduct, just some terms, just cause is the cause for which we fight, which is at a pay grade higher than your own. It's another lovely term that's often used. That's not my pay grade. And just conduct is what individual soldiers are responsible for, which has to do with proportionate harm, given the aggression, and minimization, and all different ways of interpreting this, avoidance of collateral incidents, etc. And also discrimination, discriminate targeting. The redescription is that unjust conduct can be for fighting an unjust cause, that the combatant bears the responsibility of the cause and not just the conduct. So there isn't separation of cause and conduct. This is very important. This is Jeff McMahon, essentially, views, and it's been dominating the philosophical tradition for 10 or 20 years, and we philosophers are often at West Point, the academies, engaging with, there are probably some in this room, officers who are teaching cadets and midshipmen about this and struggling head on about when you define what counts as an unjust order. Is it just an order about a specific target, or is it the cause itself? And how can the action be proportionate if the end for which you're doing it, as best you understand it, isn't? And all sorts of issues about epistemic about responsibility. How much can you know at a given time? Does a citizen who's less exposed and less at risk, and with the leisure of the newspapers and everything, and internet, have greater responsibility than the combatant on the field, et cetera? Are they in the liability net? And I think those are really important conversations that have really expanded the conversation, and they are being taken up regularly at places where it matters. So thank you for raising it. But you're quite right. Nuremberg is about, that doesn't count as a defense. Superior's orders doesn't count as a defense.
I'm Tara. I just have a quick follow-up. Regarding moral injury, can it exist amongst those who did not go to war or have, severe issues with, maybe they don't agree with going to war today, but they might have in the past, generationally, possibly? Is that a thing that exists? Is that something you've studied? And do you find it in your research?
Well, moral injury is a general term, and it's not war related. It's not war specific. It's been found, it's useful clinically in thinking about the psychological repercussions of war that aren't always about life threat, uncontrolled life threat, a sense of helplessness. And again, remember, but the moral dimensions of trauma are everywhere. 9/11, watching buildings fall, feeling helpless, Hurricane Katrina. The term survivor guilt is from the Holocaust. That's Holocaust residue, it came into being in talking to Holocaust survivors. So that's not necessarily war related. It's very much about I could have and should have and would have. Rape victims talk about this regularly. Edna Foa studies it. She thinks of it more in terms of, that's a researcher at Penn, thinks of it more in terms of the way to treat through cognitive behavioral therapy, about rethinking the situation where there's less onus on you afterwards. And sometimes it's thought of in terms of fear mechanisms, but not always. So I think it's very broad. I'm thinking about it in a war context, but it's not by any means specific. And I was actually teaching in a prison a month ago or so about some of these issues, and it was a tough group outside Baltimore, as we say. And one of the guys said to me, Dr. Sherman, I think not only, he didn't say I think not only, he said, I don't just have PTSD, I have moral injury. And he started telling me about his stuff, some of which I didn't really hear. But yeah, definitely. And he's afraid to go out back on the streets of Baltimore and West Baltimore. He's really frightened because the success rate's not good once you get out. So yes, very generalized. Thank you.
What is your thinking behind the epidemic in suicide? And is there a way that we can look and try to predict who are most at risk to prevent it?
It's a great question. I am not a statistician, clinician, social science researcher, so I've sat in some of these conversations that were very anecdotal. They were actually case-driven. In a room like this, flashing from all the bases around the world, a debriefing, and then the vice chief would say, well, what are the lessons learned? How do we go forward? Things that came up regularly were these. Shame of failures of promotion, problems at home. You're dealing with a very young group. If you talk to I've talked to Army psychiatrists a lot, the leading problem are domestic issues to do with marriages that shouldn't have happened in the first place, young marriages, often problematic homes to begin with, people getting married for the wrong reason. You get better pay and you get better housing and stuff like that. Self-medication of various kinds, and too many guns around that are on bases that aren't and that haven't been collected, and that's a whole legal issue. And so, but there's an overriding point that I think needs to be made, and that is mental health is stigmatized. And we're facing this in the current healthcare debates, whether we cover it or not. Mental health and mental well-being that requires counseling, social, whatever version of therapy you want to talk about, is a national issue and not just a military issue. The military have weapons at their disposal, but there are other ways to commit suicide, and that is you come home and you go crazy with your car. There's a lot of very risk behavior. That's how a lot of my students lose their buddies, through risk, very, very high risk activities that are likely to get you killed. So I'd say we should take on mental health more broadly than the military. It's a national problem.
Hi, I'm Irvin Schoenfeld from City College. Just a couple of comments. One about sexual harassment of women in the military. There was a study conducted in 1999 by the U.S. Army. About 37% of women soldiers were the victims in the prior 12 months of very aggressive actions toward them, including unwanted sexual approaches. And it doesn't seem to me that the U.S. Army has done that much to improve the situation. Another thought, too, is about suicide in the military. You have to remember that there was a study by RAND Corporation, 2009. About a third of the soldiers in that study were either suffering from PTSD, major depression, a traumatic brain injury. All three of those, some had two of those disorders at the same time, and those are all risk factors for suicide. And of course, Professor Sherman mentioned the problem of stigma, which inhibits people from help seeking. And superimposed upon all the moral questions that are on here is that you have soldiers who were exposed to concussive kind of explosions. Even if they're wearing protective helmets on their heads, the effects of the concussive effects can come up through the abdomen and into the head and lead to brain damage. There was a postmortem study published in Lancet Neurology this summer by Shively et al. That shows that some of the damage won't show up in a scan, and the astroglial cells, those are the cells that support the synapses, they were heavily damaged, and that it just seems that superimposed upon all the moral problems are these physical and mental problems that exist. And of course, there's questions of the moral choices of people like Donald Rumsfeld sending soldiers into the field without proper body protection, using personnel carriers that don't protect people. I mean, there's a lot of moral failures, and they go much above the soldiers in the field, who are generally good people.
Thank you so much for that comment. Just two quick follow-ons. Thank you for mentioning TBI. You can see with some of these masks that the concussive injuries really are key. And for a while, actually, you know, there's been a tug of war in the medical field about how much to emphasize TBI as a signature injury versus PTS symptoms, but they're critical. The other thing is the 2009 RAND report did make clear, we're talking about veterans as a whole. Veterans are my dad's age, were my dad's age, 89 and 18. That's a large crowd of folks. And the statistic of 22 a day includes that whole gamut. And so you have to bear that in mind. It's not, there was certainly an upsurge in 07-09. And I have to say, speaking to the Army psychiatrists, they were very, there was a sense of naivete about the war. People were coming home whole, right? You know, what is it? What were the statistics? You probably know better than I do. Something like 1 in 3 survived World War II, 1 in 6, something like Vietnam, but 1 in 9 or 1 in 10 were coming home from this. They were surviving their injuries in a way that we had never seen before because of body armor, as good or bad as it was. But they weren't surviving the head blasts, and they weren't. And also, we talk a lot about special operation forces and SEALs, but they're very prone to TBI and all the moral injury and psychological stress that comes with it. They're in closed areas with a lot of percussion. They have to conceal sound, and I've interviewed a number of them, and they tell me how hard it is to be in those areas and how many of them have concussive disorders. Probably different from football, but you know, we're just thinking now what the difference is between the kinds of concussions. So thank you for that very helpful remark.
Hi, I found your presentation really interesting. I actually grew up during a war in Sri Lanka in my entire life, so I actually found this really interesting. My question is about, I wonder if there's research being done outside the US just to see how much culture and society and the way people think about war affects the way moral injury presents itself, and also how soldiers in other countries deal with it coming in.
Lots is being done in Israel, not surprisingly. And also, again, this is not scientific, but sort of easy to understand. PTSD, moral injury, is experienced differently in cultures where generations after fight. And so you get it. There's a wonderful book that gives you a very good sense of this. Knock on the Door is the English translation. David, excuse me for a sec. He lost it. Dave, I'll think. Grossman, thank you. He actually lost his son in the last day or the next last day of the war with Lebanon, and he was writing a book about this, and then the book became almost self-fulfilling. But you get a sense in reading that book about the transgenerational transmission of trauma, but as well ability to talk about it that isn't common in a country where people don't serve or there isn't a draft. So yeah, but that country's been doing certainly a lot.
My name's John Merson. I'm a Vietnam veteran. Yes, of course, from Nantucket.
Nice to see you.
What have we learned about the experience of women from the Vietnam War, where very large numbers of women fought for the National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese Army and did all the jobs that men did? We're in combat very, very often. And so we were fighting against them. It was 40 years before women reached that point in the US military, but they had all of this experience, and many of them have written about it and spoken about it, and I wonder what's been learned.
It's a great question. Perhaps you can help us. Do you know some of the studies? I don't know those studies, so let's get the mic back. Here we go. You use the mic here.
Well, I think the most famous example is Dang Sui Chum. I'm friends with her family. She was killed by American soldiers near Quang Ngai in 1970. She was a combat surgeon, so she had to move very frequently from place to place. Her surgery was in the mountains, and she was often coming down into the villages to treat Vietnamese civilians. And her diaries were found by a friend of mine and published first in Vietnamese and then by Random House. The English title is Last Night I Dreamed of Peace. And she writes extensively about her fears, her romantic attachments, every aspect of her life in combat over a 2-year period. And she walked down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to join the military just after graduating from college in 1966. So she was the same age as me and fighting in the same area. The New York Times had a story yesterday about a nurse who was in that same area, who's alive and well today, and she talks about her fears when she had to travel to a remote outpost to treat somebody. She ran into a man who was in the military on her side, and they had to stay overnight together, and she realized she was very afraid of what he might do to her because he'd probably been away from his wife for a long time. Vietnamese woman, yeah. And so she gave him a very stern lecture about how he needed to behave in a moral way. And he said, you know, for a woman, you're really abrasive. But I think, you know, this kind of writing is available, and so many women served in combat on that side, and we fought against them, and they were fierce fighters, and we had tremendous respect for them. And I wonder what can be learned from their experience.
Well, a lot, and you've begun to help us. Thank you. I don't know that literature, so thank you so much. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk brief about something in your book about self-empathy. So it was a topic that I hadn't previously seen sort of referred to as that. I'm an Iraq war vet, and my civilian job now, I work for the Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm a mental health counselor. So empathy is something that I frequently use. And I know you said you're not a clinician, but can self-empathy be taught? And if it can it be channeled in a therapeutic sense?
Well, great. The idea came to me because I was hearing from so many those I talked to who were so mercilessly hard on themselves. And one of my students who I write about, perhaps in that chapter you're talking about, named Tom Feebrown, who was cavalry, the eyes and ears, and really good. He had this moment where he said to me, you know, Professor Sherman, I had this kind of thought that maybe I wasn't the one, the one stop, or the one stop all intelligence, you know, what was his phrase? One stop intel agent for the whole U.S. Army. Maybe my role was actually quite small. And then he said, you know, it's a little bit like I realized, am I like the cop who should have been there but was off duty, or am I like the neighbor who has a pool and didn't get around to putting a fence around the pool and a little girl falls in and gets drowned? He says, I'm more like the cop who was off duty. This was after an incident in Talifar near Mosul, which he lost his best buddy because he was on R&R in Qatar, and he thought, shit, you know, I'm on R&R in Qatar, and I knew everything about this area. Why wasn't I there? When he said, maybe I'm not the one, you know, the only one-stop intel agent for the whole U.S. Army, I thought, God, he's feeling compassion for himself. I think his guilt's breaking. And I thought about self-empathy. Why did I choose that term? Because he was still connecting with a visceral sense of hurt. He had muscle memory of the hurt. It wasn't going away. He could touch it, feel it. The Stoics talk about still being able to feel an injury like a scar. You know, he still felt the scar. but it wasn't as raw as it had been. It wasn't bleeding like it had been. And so I thought of that, but then later, about 6 months, I was in a conference with Brett Litz, who is a researcher on moral injury up at BU in the VA in Boston. And he said, that's like my idea of, he calls it an empty chair technique, which you might find useful. It has an awful name called adaptive disclosure, which I find some made up thingamajiggy. But anyway, the idea is, in those kinds of cases of survivor guilt, bring an empty chair into the room of the person whom you believe you could have and should have and would have helped if you were at the right place at the right moment, your buddy. But it could have been a civilian or something like that. What would they say? Would they hold you, this is a moral, reactive attitude, would they hold you as accountable for that loss as you hold yourself? And I think what Brett's trying to do is cultivate a sense of self-empathy, a sense of compassion, letting go, where you still know what it feels like. So you're not cold to it, but it's not screamingly hurting.
How do you protect yourself from what you do?
I'm at the Center for Ballet and the Arts this semester, which was sort of a lucky thing. I've done modern dance a lot in my life, and I couldn't write another book on this right now. But I can think about other things, and in fact, I am thinking a little bit about, here's something you might not have known. The ballet began as a military art. Louis XIV was a great ballet dancer, and he brought the ballet to the battlefield and the battlefield back. Ballet de Corps, the court ballet, was an enterprise that went back and forth from the court for the drill and the, effacé, a lot of the ways you hold your body, and fencing, that kind of thing, is about courtly manners in the courtroom, but also on the battlefield. And so that's my answer. I'm taking it a little lighter right now.